dark side. Light this bitch up.
What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. Today is Earth Day, and I wanted to make sure that I did something that was viable, something that was worthwhile on Earth Day. And I can't imagine having a better guest than my guest today. He is a public intellectual. He's a professor of linguistics, a political activist, and a social critic. And he's also written more books than I have read, including this one, Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. And he is my guest today, and his name is Noam Chomsky. Noam, how are you, buddy?
Pretty well.
Good. Thank you for coming today. I really wanted to have someone on that knew a lot more than I did about the environment. I'm not an academic. I'm a high school graduate and a college dropout, but I do a lot of reading. And I wanted to start this show today, if it's okay with you, to discuss what happened decades ago when things started to look a little bit bleak as far as awareness levels of the environment. I seem to remember institutions like the Chamber of Commerce, petroleum industry lobbyists. They began a campaign that seemed to work. At the time, I think in the late 90s, it was something like only 32% of people believed in man-made climate change. I was wondering if you could tell me how far back we set ourselves by having propagandists tell us that global warming was a hoax.
We may have set ourselves as far back as extinction. That's not an exaggeration. There has been a corporate campaign for 50 years now to try to prevent concern about the imminent threat of global warming. Go back in the history, by the 1970s, the leading specialists on global warming, the ones who were carrying out the most intensive investigations, had the most detailed results, were the fine scientists of the energy corporations, ExxonMobil, others. They were investigating this in great detail, sending messages back to the management saying, we continue to use fossil fuels, it's going to destroy organized life on Earth. Well, the messages were filed in drawers. Let's forget about it. That became difficult by 1988, when James Hansen, the renowned geophysicist, testified before Congress. And it was widely publicized testimony in which he warned about the grave threats of global warming to organized life on Earth. Couldn't be kept quiet any longer. A lot of publicity. So the corporations gathered their PR experts who advised them to follow the same script that had been followed by the tobacco companies, the lead companies, the asbestos companies, when it was discovered that they were murdering people. And the technique that was used to deflect any action was not to deny the facts. If you deny the facts, you're quickly refuted. So doubt. Say, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We ought to think about it more. The case of climate, we haven't figured out everything about sunspots. Maybe there's cloud cover. A case of lead, could be other factors. Meanwhile, let's just keep growing the economy as fast as possible. Small footnote, increasing profits as fast as possible, but we don't mention that part. Let's just grow the economy as fast as possible. We'll have a richer, better society. And maybe later on, if it ever turns there's anything to this, we can get to it. That's the technique. It's worked very well. One of the effects is, and it's part of a much broader campaign to distrust science. It's very important for the corporate sector, has been for 60, 70 years, to get people to distrust science. Why should we trust what these liberal elitists are telling us? I mean, I've talked to people who are influenced by this. Once had a meeting with paint contractors. They in Massachusetts. And their position, which is kind of understandable, is, well, we know perfectly well that lead paint is the best way to paint a house, or it's far better than anything else. Then this bureaucrat comes from Washington wearing a suit. He's never painted a house in his life, doesn't know anything about paint. And he tells us, well, some scientist said it harms children. Why should I believe him? He's trying to take away my business. Because if I can't use lead paint, I'm going to use my small business will collapse. And the goal of the corporate sector is to fortify these ideas, saying, yeah, why should you listen to scientists, just a bundle of liberal elitists sitting up there in Washington wearing suits? That's the campaign. I mean, you're familiar with it, I'm sure. So it's basically a campaign that says distrust science because they don't know anything. In fact, if you listen to the scientists, they disagree about all kind of things, which is quite true. Science is an honest enterprise. You don't make claims that aren't true. If it's just probability that something's true, you say so, it might be wrong. That's the nature of serious inquiry. So corporate propaganda can play on this, say they're not even sure, they have some doubts. Why should you believe them and lose your business? So, and this is across the board. That's where a lot of the anti-vaccine movement comes from. Why should we believe the scientists? Then why should we trust the institutions? And there's a background. There's a good reason not to trust the institutions. They work against you. That's their role. The role of the institutions, particularly during the neoliberal period, the last 45 years or so, the goal of the institutions is to enrich the powerful in the corporate sector and to harm everyone else. Why should we pay any attention to them? Distrust in institutions makes some sense. Then this huge corporate campaign comes along and says, well, just live your life. And it plays out in public opinion and even in policy. Remember, there's one political party, Republican Party, which is dedicated to destruction of organized human life on Earth. Of course, that's not the way they put it. What they're dedicated to is abject service to the rich and the corporate sector. Every legislative proposal is designed to enrich the very rich and to strengthen the corporate sector and harm everyone else. One of the consequences of that is object to anything that might deal with the climate problem. That's a kind of consequence. It's not, we would like to destroy the world for our grandchildren. That just happens to be a consequence of our policies. Okay, you see it everywhere. Take a look at HR 1, the first bill that the Republican House passed, top priority. Nice rhetoric about improving lives by making energy more accessible and so on. If you read about it and think for 5 seconds, it's saying, let's enrich the fossil fuel industries. That's HR 1. There's a very interesting background to that, which tells us a lot about how American politics works. But this is not built into the Republican Party. In fact, if you go back as recently as 2008, not that far back, John McCain was running for president on the Republican ticket. He had a limited climate changed flank in his program, not much, but something. And congressional Republicans were beginning to think, well, maybe we ought to do something. The Koch brothers conglomerate, this huge energy conglomerate, had been working for years to try to ensure that the Republicans would be a denialist party. And as soon as they got wind of this break, they launched a huge offensive, bribing congressmen, threatening them with primary challenges, massive lobbying campaigns, astroturfing, fake popular organizations, real juggernaut. The Republican Party turned on a dime. Ever since then, they have been 100% denialist. 100%. And that's how it's a striking example of how democracy functions in the United States.
What is the motivation of the media to, I think I heard you mention on an interview from about 12 years ago, how the media played their role in this when they would put on the front page on the New York Times the two sides, even though one side was represented by 98% of scientists and the other side was represented by maybe a weatherman or something. So why did they play that role and make it seem like they, and I guess this would kind of fall in line with manufacturing consent from the public, who then would look at it and think that this was an argument worth having?
Well, first of all, we have to distinguish various segments of the media. So the biggest cable channel, Fox News, barely even pretends to be a media source. It's an echo chamber for the far right. So they don't care. We just saw that in the brought to the fore in the Dominion suit. They don't care. It's not their job. They're not a media organization. The Murdoch media are a political organization working for the corporate sector and the very wealthy. So they become a kind of an echo chamber for right-wing politics. Take a look at talk radio. It's almost all in the hands of the far right corporate sector. Plenty of people listen to it. Truck driver, housewife, turn on the radio. What do you get? I often listen to it just out of curiosity if I'm stuck in a traffic jam. It's unbelievable. I mean, it is so far right, you can't even find it on the spectrum. It's and it's all told with, the techniques are very interesting. Complete confidence. You listen to Rush Limbaugh, it sounds like, or the more recent guys, sounds like they know everything. Any question that comes up, they have a battery of people with computers somewhere who look something up and they come back and they're actors basically, and they're actors trained to look extremely confident and sound, and of course very supercilious, so dismiss anything that questions their supreme knowledge and confidence. Well, you're a housewife doing the dishes, you're a truck driver bored, somebody stuck in a traffic jam. Sounds convincing. Why shouldn't I believe it? And in fact, why should I believe these liberals who regard me as deplorable, Hillary Clinton? Why should I listen to them? The Democratic Party doesn't do anything about it. They're not a party. They used to be a party with commitment to working people and the poor, but that's old hat. Since Carter, they've been basically a party of affluent professionals, people like you and me who have time to be on the internet. That's who they are. So they're not countering it. They're not organizing on the ground. One of the major achievements of the Reagan administration, like Thatcher, when they launched the neoliberal attack, was the first move, destroy labor unions. Take a look. That was their first move. Made very good sense. you're going to launch an attack on the population, eliminate the means of defense. Labor has historically been the main means of defense, brings people together, their educational programs, and so on. So it's an onslaught. And there's been very little resistance. There's popular resistance, but not much organized resistance. And it's been very effective. You look at polls among Republicans, very small percentage, maybe 10, 15%, even think that global warming is an issue. It's higher among Democrats, but nowhere near as high as it should be.
The Green New Deal, it was a political idea with AOC. It was the title of the book that you co-wrote with Robert Pollin. You've described the implementation of a Green New Deal as essential. What people like myself who lean on experts, scientists to sort of tell us what these details are, I haven't heard much as far as what the details would actually look like in a global Green New Deal. Can you give me a sense or an idea of what that would look like?
Well, if you take a look at the book and subsequent work that Bob Pollin has done, sometimes together with me, sometimes alone, spelled out in extensive detail. Here's detailed, explicit proposals of what has to be done in order to meet minimal conditions for preservation, even improvement of the environment, all feasible within a couple percentage of GDP, probably less than was spent in bailing out the financial institutions for their losses in the COVID crisis. It's all within range. I can't run through it now, but if you take a look, it's spelled out in detail. Bob Pollin is in the lead in doing this work, but others have done similar analyses on similar assumptions. Jeffrey Sachs, the International Energy Association, they're all pretty much within the same range. Some details here and there. In fact, there's a legislation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just reintroduced a couple days ago. You wouldn't read it in the newspapers. Reintroduced legislation that she and Ed Markey, senator from Massachusetts, the two of them had proposed a couple of years ago. They keep reintroducing it for a Green New Deal. Doesn't spell out all the details, but it's basically the same set of ideas. Doesn't even get discussed. Did you see it in the newspaper?
No, I saw it on her Twitter. That's it.
Who's interested in the fact that there's one legislative proposal that might save us from destruction? Not interesting. Not even a footnote somewhere. When you raised a good point about the media trying to be the liberal media trying to be balanced. 95% of scientists say this. There's half a dozen guys who say that. So let's give them equal time. I mean, if you take a look at the correspondence, there are journalists for the Washington Post, the New York Times, who do careful reports on the latest scientific studies. So if you actually read the reports carefully, you can find out what's happening. But not many people do that. In fact, not many people even read the newspapers. They may look at headlines. Yeah. If you look at headlines, it's two sides. One side says it's very serious. The other side says we don't know. And then the corporate propaganda comes along about why believe science altogether. It's just a bunch of libtards, and so on. So what you end up is a population that doesn't see that we're falling over the precipice. Now, it's not everybody. There are things that don't get reported that are important. Like take my friend Bob Pollin again. He and his group at the University of Massachusetts, the Political Economy Research Institute, Perry, have been working on the ground, organizing, working with miners in West Virginia, coal mining state. It's been pretty effective. They've gotten the United Mine Workers to approve a transition program in which miners would be helped, as they should be, to move towards other occupations, to help develop a sustainable economy, much better jobs, better pay, much better life. And they're accepting it. Same has happened with unions with their work with unions in Ohio, extractive industries in California. Can be done. Of course, the miners who are willing to accept the transition program in West Virginia are represented in Congress by a coal baron, Joe Manchin, one of the biggest recipients of fossil fuel funding. He's not going to allow it. Well, that means you have to start organizing. The Democratic Party or somebody would have to start organizing on the ground. It's not going to happen without them. That's what labor unions used to be for.
Mm-hmm. A lot of this touches the concept of building a new society. There's a quote. I don't remember who said the quote. I bet you remember. If power is in the hands of the governed, and the governed lose their function of giving consent, how they are governed, can we successfully build a new society?
That quote, I presume you're quoting from David Hume.
That's right.
350 years ago. Mm-hmm. First great work on what we now call political science, foundations of the theory of foundation principles of government, basic principles of government, some title like that. He opens one of the great modern philosophers of the Enlightenment, conservative, incidentally, not by no means left. He opens this major tract, first paragraph, by posing a paradox. He says he is struck by the easiness with which the governors can subdue the governed. This is why is this the case? Power is in the hands of the governed if they use it. The governors don't have the power. They could be overthrown. So how come the mass of the governed allow themselves to be ruled by the governors? He says the only explanation is consent. Doesn't go into it, but it's an early version of what Walter Lippmann later called manufacture of consent. The governors have devised techniques to induce the governed to consent to their subjugation to the masters. Adam Smith wrote about it at the same time. He was a friend of Hume's, about the same thing. Later, it was developed in Marxist theories of false consciousness, Gramsci's concepts of hegemonic common sense imposed by power systems, a liberal democratic theory in the United States. Walter Lippmann, Harold Laswell, Reinhold Niebuhr, the other great liberal commentators on liberal democracy, discuss the same thing, except they praise it. There's a difference in attitudes. They praise it, like for Lippmann, major leading intellectual of the 20th century, a liberal, of course, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, liberal, very influential figure. For him, manufacture of consent is, as he described it, a new art in the practice of democracy. We can use it to ensure that democracy functions properly. How does democracy function properly? When the general population stays out of our hair. Their role is to be spectators, not participants. They're supposed to show up every couple of years, push a button, which they choose one or another of the options that we present to them, then go home, look at their video games. Not at his time, but do something else. He was a member of the what's called the Creel Commission, the commission that Woodrow Wilson set up, first state propaganda commission. It was designed to convert a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics to drive the country into support for Wilson's war. It was a pacifist country. They didn't want to be involved in European wars, and they had to be shifted. And the Creel Commission was one of the ways of doing it. It was very successful. Lippmann was very impressed by their success. Another person who was impressed on the same commission was Edward Bernays, who went on to become one of the founders of the huge public relations industry. He called it engineering of consent. He said this is a central element of democracy, is for us, the smart guys, to engineer the consent of the masses. They're too stupid and ignorant to know what's good for them, so we have to engineer consent. That's a huge public relations industry. Most of it is devoted to commercial advertising, which is a huge mode of trying to induce people, as the business press put it a century ago. You got to induce people to focus on the superficial things in life, like consumer consumption, whatever. Let them focus on that, but stay out of affairs of state. That's our business, not the business of the public. That's liberal democratic theory. You go to the right wing, it's much harsher. Okay, the liberals are much more interesting because they show the limits of what can be imagined within the dominant, the reigning doctrinal system. And take Reinhold Niebuhr, who's revered as called the theologian of the liberal establishment. His view was that people are stupid and ignorant. We therefore have to impose on them necessary illusions, title of one of my other books on this topic, and emotionally potent oversimplifications. That'll keep them in line. And that's understood across the board when we have to, when the United States was building up to the Cold War back in the late 40s, it was understood that the population didn't want this. So as one leading figure put it, we have to scare the hell out of people. It's the only way we can do it. Now you got to scare the hell out of people about China taking over the world, or Putin conquering Europe, or whatever the next thing is. One thing or another to try to keep the people in line, passive, obedient, paying attention to something else. It's just overwhelming. It's the way the fundamental institutions of society work. And you can understand it. Why should you allow people to think? It's a terrible idea. People think they might think about David Hume's question. Why should we accept the rule of the governors? Don't want people to think about that. So let's work out all sorts of ways to divert people. For the current Republican Party, it's holy writ. Ever since Nixon, they've understood very well that they can't win an election by coming to people with their actual policies. You can't get votes if you come and say, look, I represent the very rich corporate sector. I want to set policies that are going to enrich them and stab you in the back. Please vote for me.
Be a hell of a bumper sticker, though. No.
So you have to turn their attention to something else, cultural issues and so on. It's the whole nature of the Republican Party.
You mentioned the cost of the pandemic. You mentioned the financial crisis. If I may throw Middle Eastern wars into that bag as well, and I may be oversimplifying this, but if you're, it uses fear as well, the weapons of mass destruction. But from an environmental perspective, I know that the military industrial complex and military conflict around the world is one of the largest pollutants. In fact, I think, and I could be wrong about this, well, I won't make the claim, but I know that the American military, just on its own, creates more pollution for the world than a lot of countries do, which I find to be staggering. But I was wondering if we peg the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war at 3 trillion, let's just say, is that money because it's federal dollars that could have been used for environmental programs instead?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
I'm sorry. Let's say we peg the price tag at Afghanistan and Iraq at around $3 trillion. The environmental impact that those conflicts have had on the planet are probably not calculated yet. A lot of it is still being the inventory is still being done. But is that money? Could that because it's federal dollars? Could that have been bookmarked for environmental programs instead? I'm just trying to figure out how the government decides what they want to throw their money at.
Well, actually, a majority of the funds that can be used, the available funds, go to the military in one form or another. I mean, there are things you can't touch, like automatic expenses of the government paying the debt and so on. But when you look at the parts that there's some choice over, in fact, a majority go to the military. So yes, you cut that back sharply and you'd have plenty of money for what's needed to develop a sustainable economy, but try to touch it. Remember, what's called the military-industrial complex is pretty much the core of the industrial and financial system. It includes the banks that lend to it, manufacturers. I mean, there are some straight military manufacturers, but they use things that are produced by the rest of the industrial system. It's all very tightly linked. And the military isn't there. The military in the United States, fortunately, is under civilian control. The military doesn't set policy. So far, might change. But they have been under civilian control. And they're perfectly happy to have gifts given to them naturally, but it's the civilian authorities who are determining it. Sometimes, in some cases, even over the objections of the military. So let's take one thing of enormous importance that Dan Ellsberg and other strategic analysts have been talking about for years. What's called our deterrent system, nuclear deterrent system is a triad. One part of it is land-based missiles. Every strategic analyst knows that the land-based missiles are a threat to the United States. They serve no purpose except to be a threat to the United States for a very simple reason. They are land-based, fixed. Any adversary knows exactly where they are. That means if there's any threat anywhere in the world, and it looks like maybe a war is coming, you've got to fire them. It's called use them or lose them. If you don't use them, they're gone. There'll be a strike that'll wipe them out. That sharply increases the danger of war. And remember, a war wipes out everyone. There's no escape. The country that launches a war will be destroyed, even if there's no retaliation, simply from the effects of nuclear winter. So here's something that's an enormous threat to the United States, provides nothing in the way of deterrence. Undetectable submarines can have enough nuclear power to destroy everything. I mean, one advanced submarine can destroy a couple hundred cities all over the world, and they're basically undetectable. The enemy doesn't know where they are. So that alone, let alone the bomber forces, and way more than's needed for a deterrent. The Titan missiles and something are mainly a threat to the United States. Be much safer if you'd got rid of them. The military knows that. Can't get it through Congress for good reason. Pentagon has been smart enough to distribute the sites for these in rural counties all over the world, all over the country, where they're a large part of the economy. The neoliberal programs have pretty much devastated the rural economy. And these are among the few things that bring in jobs, commerce, profits, and so on. So if the local congressional representative is going to demand that they stay there, well, it happens to be very harmful, in fact, may destroy us, and it serves no purpose, but it's untouchable. Many things like this. The military is, of course, there for a purpose. That's the way you ensure that you can dominate the world, by the threat of military action. You have to look at, they're not ridiculous, they're stupid, they're not stupid, they think about these things. You take a look at it. The official policy, STRATCOM, Strategic Command, runs nuclear weapons programs. They have documents, you can read them. Like the most important of them, there's from, that I know of, is in the Clinton era, 1995. It's called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. What do we do now that the Russians are gone? It's a problem. We can't say the Russians are coming. So that's Clinton, 1995. It's worth reading. I've published parts of it over and over again, but nobody wants to look at them. But it's worth reading. What they say is we have to maintain a first strike capacity. We have to create what they call a national persona of being irrational and vindictive, because that'll frighten and terrify people. They'll be afraid to step on our toes. So look, irrational and vindictive, and nuclear weapons have to be the core of our strategy, even though we have no intention of using them, because they cast a shadow over conventional operations. Like if anyone tries to interfere with our intervention, aggression, subversion, we can wave nuclear weapons at them. So we'll be irrational, vindictive, waving the threat of nuclear weapons, and then we can get what we want. It's essentially the madman theory, which is attributed to Nixon on very thin evidence. But here it is in official policy, Clinton policy. That's the liberals again.
And the doomsday clock, when Trump was in office, was the closest it had ever been to midnight. Isn't that right?
Sorry?
The doomsday clock, when Trump was in office, that was the closest it had ever been to midnight, I believe.
If I didn't catch it.
Sorry, the doomsday clock.
Doomsday
when Donald
clock.
Trump was in office, it was the closest it had ever been to midnight, I think.
The doomsday clock is the best simple characterization of the state of the world security system. It was established in 1947, right after the atom bomb. At that point, it was 7 minutes to midnight. Midnight means termination, we're finished. It's fluctuated over the years. During the Trump years, the analysts abandoned minutes, too close to destruction, moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. Less goes every January. Last January, it was moved to 90 seconds to midnight. The two main threats are standard ones: growing threat of nuclear war, and an unwillingness of the leadership class to deal with the impending disaster of climate destruction. So now we're 90 seconds to midnight, closest it's ever been. Next January, it'll move forward again.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit here. Your linguistic theory of biolinguistic theorizes that the structure of language are biologically preset in the human mind. I was wondering, how outlandish is it to say that to theorize if we have the same types of presets that takes into account our need to protect our immediate environment? Does that make any sense?
Push that too far. I mean, the study of the structure of language and the structure of our cognitive systems can, in principle, tell us something about fundamental human nature, but doesn't reach far enough to lead to particular conclusions about what happens in specific institutional structures. It's the institutional structures that have an overwhelming influence everywhere. We should think about concrete cases. It's much more sensible. So let's say you're appointed to be the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, biggest bank. That's you. You're now sitting in the executive office. A request comes along from the fossil fuel from ExxonMobil for a huge loan. You have a choice. If you give them the loan, you're helping destroy the lives of your grandchildren. Suppose you don't give them a loan. What happens? You're kicked out. Somebody else is brought in who will give them the loan. That's an institutional necessity. If you don't maximize profit and market share, you're out. Somebody else is in who will do it. So now you, James, sitting in that chair, what do you decide? Well, think what goes through your mind. He says, either I give them the loan or somebody else gives them the loan. And that somebody else won't be a nice guy like me. He'll be much more savage and brutal. So therefore, whatever little bit can be done, I better give them the loan. Okay? That's what goes through your mind, something like that. It happens at just about every level of society, something like that. Take a look at the institutional structures, pursuit of profit, market share, necessarily, or else you're thrown out. It's a suicide pact.
Okay. Drug dealers have the same philosophy. If I'm not going to sell it to them, somebody else will, right?
Sorry?
I said drug dealers have the same philosophy. If I don't sell it to them, somebody else will. So it's a capitalist idea.
The nature of the institutions. Mm-hmm. The problem is, there are particularly dangerous individuals, like Trump, for example, or Henry Kissinger, or others who are just dangerous people. But by and large, it's institutional structures that set constraints. It's pretty much the same for the media. If you're a reporter and you start reporting the wrong things that are raising too many questions about power, you'll be called to the editor's office and told, you're not really doing your job properly. Maybe you should go off to the Metro desk for a couple of months. Everybody in the press has stories like that.
I have two more questions before I let you go. One of them I just thought of when you were talking about when we were discussing the military. The Nord Stream pipeline bombing, the sabotage in the Caspian Sea, I think it is. Where do you agree with Seymour Hersh that was an American operation?
Well, it's a very interesting case. When the sabotage took place, if you read the world press, outside the little Western propaganda bubble, everybody just took for granted. They just describe it as a U.S. sabotage operation because it's obvious. Nobody else had the capacity. Nobody else had the motive. Biden had openly stated that if Russia invades Ukraine, we'll destroy the pipeline. When the pipeline was destroyed, they just exulted, total euphoria. You don't need Seymour Hersh's investigation. It was just taken for granted by everybody. Well, it didn't prove it, of course, but just overwhelmingly obvious. Who else could it possibly be? Well, get inside the propaganda bubble where we are. The first thing that was said, it was obviously the Russians. I mean, it's outlandish. Why should the Russians bomb one of their main capital investments, which they were relying on, crucially, for their relations with Europe? Claim is, well, they wanted to punish Europe by cutting off the gas. You can do that by flipping a switch.
Yeah.
You don't have to blow up your biggest capital investment. So that was the main story, remains the main story. I mean, it's kind of beyond insanity. Outside the United States, people laugh, you know. Then comes the propaganda system. It's very clever. A good propaganda, it's like the fossil fuel industry. You don't deny the facts, you cast doubt. So read the press. It's quite interesting. What you read is articles saying, well, it's not certain that it was the Russians. There's some doubt about it. See how open-minded we are? We're carrying out debate about whether it was the Russians or not. Maybe it was not. Maybe it was a bunch of Ukrainians in a sailboat. You know, let's look into that. You know, so that shows what an open and free country we are. We really debate these things, but you don't. But it's within a set of presuppositions. You don't discuss the possibility of what's overwhelmingly likely, namely that the US blew it up for its own purposes, just as it said it would. Don't discuss that. So let's have a lively debate, narrowly constrained by certain fixed assumptions. Then it looks like we're free and open, but you instill the assumptions, not by assertion, just by presupposition. That's clever propaganda, like the fossil fuel companies, the tobacco companies, others. You don't deny the facts. If you put if you even discuss the major issues, it opens it up for discussion. You don't want to do that. Put them in the background. Talk about something else. You know, that's
How optimistic? How optimistic are you about our planet's future? I know that's a very broad question. I know a lot of things have to happen. I'm just kind of curious because I'm not very optimistic. I don't think that humans learn their lessons very quickly, especially collectively, and especially 8 billion of us all trying to get on the same page. So I'm just kind of wondering what your optimism is like these days.
Basically, you have two choices. You can say, everything's hopeless, I give up, help ensure that the worst will happen, or you can grasp the opportunities that exist, and they do exist, and maybe you can make it a better world. It's not a very hard choice.
So you're optimistic.
You know that there are opportunities, so you grasp them.
First of all, what's your dog's name before I let you go? Because he really wants you to go. What's your dog's name? No.
My dog, I can't say it, or there'll be a rush to the door because they're sitting right under my desk, both of them. And there's a couple of sounds that they respond to, like their names.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Well, listen. I'm gonna let you go. It was amazing talking to you again. This is our third time. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this show, my very first episode was Noam Chomsky 2 years ago. So you kicked off the show and kicked off the actual podcast series, and it was amazing to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Nice to be with you. Glad what you're doing. That's
Thank
what
you very much.
Optimism. Kind
Thank
of
you,
thing
sir.
you're doing.
I appreciate that. You have a good night.
Very good to see you.
Very good to see you as well. Oh, sometimes I feel really not as intelligent as I'd like when I get out of a. I totally tried to like sound smart. Here, I'm going to read the question again, just because I think I want to own my stupidity sometimes. You're linguistic. I can't remember what he said, but his answer was the best because he was just like, that's like the biggest reach I ever heard, James. Your linguistic theory or biolinguistic theorizes that the structure of language are biologically preset in the human mind. Is it possible that the survival of our planet is also preset? Oh, fuck, I'm stupid. Anyways, I love having Noam Chomsky on, and I hope you did too. It is. I'm no longer nervous when I talk to him. We now kind of know each other. I call him Noam in emails. He calls me James. And he's one of my favorite guests because I can just ask a question and basically just sit back and listen to someone a lot smarter than me give an answer. And I think the interview went well because of that. I definitely didn't want to get into any type of back and forth. He's 94 years old, and he's literally dedicated his life to try to show us what bad people do to us. That is the kind of man that I think you're supposed to look up to, even if you disagree with him. And there's a lot of people, I got a bunch of emails and like Facebook messages from people who are right-wing and, calling him a fool and everything. And shut up. The guy is so smart. He's still chugging along. It was funny because he asked me to enable captions. And I didn't realize it was because of his hearing, because whenever he sends me emails, he sends me this in really big font. And and so I thought his eyesight was bad. So I guess his hearing is going too. But that brain, I don't think anything's ever going to conquer that brain. He's probably my favorite guest, I would say. I think I learned something. I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the more practical solutions. Like I heard Bob Paulin, who was his co-author in the Green New Deal, and talk about how, even retro, like he was speaking at UMass, University of Massachusetts, and how that building is a net zero building when it comes to carbon footprint because of all the retrofitting. And I wish I would have thought about it at the time, because I'm just thinking of it now. Like if there was a way that we could figure out how to make people rich by protecting the environment, is that one way to go? Like if all of these evil people who control the world are motivated by dollars, can we figure out a way to just keep them rich? And maybe then they'll finally move. Because despite the fact that I am not optimistic, I think it would be a good idea for all of us to just kind of take a look at what our lifestyles are. And at least at the end of the day, when we watch the nuclear winter provide the shade we've been longing for all these many years, we may be able to say, I didn't do that. I did my part. My wife and kids no longer live in my house. My thermostat's at 65. I actually don't put it there because I'm an environmentalist. I put it there because I like being cold and then trying to get warm so much more than being warm and trying to cool off. But apparently I just saved like 3 tons of fossil fuels, or actually I guess we run by propane in this house. It's really expensive too. But things like that. I think I'm going to try to educate myself a little bit more on this subject, because it was a fun rabbit hole to go down when I was preparing for this interview. And, Noam Chomsky is the kind of guy you need to prepare for. And, there's a lot of things to sort of be optimistic about, but there's so much more not to be when you think of who holds the power and who holds the money and all that kind of stuff. And so I wish I had an answer. I don't, except for maybe just individually, we can all kind of do a better job, and then ignore all the people that say that climate change is a hoax, because that's just silly. My big thanks to Noam Chomsky. I'm going to try to do tomorrow a sort of post Earth Day wrap up show. Kareem Assad's going to join us. I'm going to get a couple other people to join us as well, just to talk about what Professor Chomsky had to say, and maybe expand the conversation a little bit. Because every day's Earth Day, dude. I promise never to say that again. We'll see you next time on Blackballed.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Black.